A cry in the darkness. The December wind howled through the empty streets of Montgomery, Alabama, carrying with it the sharp sting of winter. The city was quiet, the usual sounds of life muffled by the cold. It was late, well past midnight, and the streets were nearly deserted. The only signs of movement were the occasional flickering streetlights and the scurry of rats darting between piles of trash. David Calloway, a man of few words and even fewer attachments, pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders, his breath curling into mist as he trudged along the cracked sidewalk. He had just finished locking up his small auto repair shop, a business he had built with his own two hands, and was making his way home. To most, David was just another tired mechanic, his hands permanently stained with grease, his knuckles rough from years of hard work. He was a man who kept to himself, living a simple life, fixing cars and minding his own business. But despite his tough exterior, there was something about this night that unsettled him. As he walked past an alley near an old, abandoned grocery store, he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. He stopped in his tracks, his breath hitching. The noise was so soft that at first he thought he had imagined it. But then it came again. A weak, fragile cry. David frowned. It wasn't the distant whimper of a stray dog, nor the rustling of the wind through the empty alleyway. It was something else. Something human. His heart pounded as he turned toward the darkness. The alley was narrow, littered with broken bottles, discarded food wrappers, and the stench of decay. He hesitated for only a second before stepping forward, his boots crunching against the debris-strewn pavement. Then he saw it. A small bundle, barely visible in the dim light, nestled between two trash bins. It took his brain a second to register what he was looking at. A baby. His stomach twisted. The infant was wrapped in a thin, tattered blanket, barely shielding its tiny body from the biting cold. Its skin was dark, a stark contrast against the pale, grayish cloth. Its face was scrunched up, its little hands trembling. She was freezing. David crouched down, his large, calloused hands reaching out. He hesitated. How could anyone do this? The baby's breath was coming in short, shallow gasps, her cries weakening. She was on the edge of survival. He couldn't just leave her there. Without another thought, he scooped her up, pressing her against his chest, shielding her from the wind. The moment his warmth enveloped her, her tiny body relaxed slightly, though her trembling didn't stop. "You're okay now," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "I got you." But his mind was racing. What do I do now? A fateful decision. David's house was only a few blocks away, a small one-story home that was as unremarkable as the man himself. But tonight, it would become something more than just four walls and a roof. By the time he reached his doorstep, his fingers were numb, but the baby was still alive. He kicked open the door, the warmth of his home instantly washing over him. He hurried inside, carefully setting the baby down on the old couch. His hand shook as he unwrapped the thin blanket, revealing her tiny form. She couldn't have been more than a few days old. Her skin, though dark, had a slight bluish tint, a warning sign of hypothermia. David moved quickly. He ran to his bedroom, grabbing an old flannel shirt and a clean towel. He wrapped her up again, holding her close, rubbing her arms and legs gently to bring warmth back into her body. "Come on, baby girl," he whispered. "Stay with me." He should have called the police. He knew that, but something held him back. The moment he had picked her up, something had shifted inside him. She had been left to die, tossed away like garbage. Why? David didn't know much about babies, but he knew she needed more than just warmth. He moved to the kitchen, cradling her in one arm while searching his cabinets with the other. Nothing. Milk. He needed milk. With one last glance at the baby, he grabbed his truck keys. A silent town watches. The convenience store was nearly empty when he arrived. The cashier, a woman in her mid-50s, gave him a strange look when he walked in. David, A rough-looking man with a scruffy beard and grease-stained hands was not the type to buy baby formula at 1 in the morning. He grabbed a can of powdered formula and a baby bottle. As he placed them on the counter, the woman raised an eyebrow. "Didn't peg you for the father type," she said, scanning the items. David forced a tight smile. "It's for a friend." The woman didn't push, but he could feel her gaze lingering as he paid and hurried back to his truck. By the time he returned home, the baby's breathing had steadied, but she was still weak. He mixed the formula as best he could, testing the warmth on his wrist before carefully bringing the bottle to her lips. For a moment, she didn't respond. Then, her tiny mouth latched on, sucking weakly. Relief flooded through David's chest. "She's a fighter," he muttered. And in that moment, he realized something. He wasn't going to call the police. This baby had been left for dead. If the people who abandoned her came forward now, who was to say they wouldn't hurt her again? No, David had found her. And from this moment on, she was his to protect. The first night, he stayed up all night, watching her. He didn't sleep, didn't let his mind wander to the million questions circling in his head. Who was she? Why had she been abandoned? What kind of person could leave a helpless infant in the cold, surrounded by garbage? Morning came too soon, and with it, a sense of finality. David wasn't just some guy who had stumbled upon a lost child anymore. He was something more. He was her protector. As the baby slept in the crook of his arm, her tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, David made a silent promise. "I don't know who you are, little one," he whispered, "but you're mine now." And as the sun rose over the quiet town, David Calloway knew that his life had changed forever. A home for her. A new beginning. The morning light filtered through the small windows of David Calloway's house, casting a soft glow over the baby girl curled up in the bundle of blankets. The night had been long, filled with worry, exhaustion, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. But now, as he sat in his old recliner, the weight of reality settled on his shoulders. This wasn't a temporary situation. He had made his decision. He was keeping her. David had never been a father, never even considered it. His life had been simple, revolving around cars, work, and solitude. He had always assumed he wasn't the kind of man built for family life. But as he looked down at the tiny girl, her delicate fingers curled around his thumb, he knew there was no turning back. She had no one else. And now she had him. The first hurdles. Caring for a newborn was no easy task, and David quickly realized how unprepared he was. For one, the baby needed a name. He couldn't keep calling her baby forever. He thought about it as he paced the living room, bouncing her gently in his arms whenever she fussed. He ran through names in his mind, discarding each one that didn't feel right. Then, as he looked out the window, watching the first snowfall of the season, it hit him. Winter. It was simple, strong, a reminder of the night he found her. "Winter Calloway," he murmured, testing the name on his tongue. The baby stirred in his arms, her little face scrunching up before relaxing again. David took it as a sign. Winter it is. Naming her was the easy part. The real challenge was figuring out how to take care of her. His house wasn't exactly baby-friendly. The floors were covered in tools and old newspapers. The kitchen was bare aside from beer and leftover takeout, and he barely knew how to boil water, let alone prepare baby formula properly. By midday, Winter had gone through 3 diapers, except David hadn't had any diapers. He had tried using an old towel at first, but after an accident that left his shirt soaked, he realized there was no getting around it. He needed supplies, and that meant stepping into uncharted territory, the baby aisle at the store, a town that watches. Montgomery was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone's business. David had spent years keeping to himself, avoiding unnecessary interactions. But today, there was no avoiding the curious eyes of his neighbors. He walked into the local Wright's general store, his heart pounding, with Winter tucked securely in his arms. The moment he stepped inside, the bell above the door chimed, and all eyes turned to him. The cashier, Betty Walker, a plump woman in her 60s who had known David since he was a teenager, gasped audibly when she saw him carrying the infant. "David Calloway," she said, her voice laced with disbelief. "What on earth are you doing with a baby?" He shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his grip on Winter. Shopping. A few other customers had stopped mid-aisle, watching the exchange with barely disguised curiosity. Mrs. Porter, the town's nosiest gossip, stood frozen by the canned goods, her mouth slightly open. David ignored them. He walked straight toward the baby aisle, scanning the shelves. Diapers, formula, baby wipes. What the hell was the difference between all these bottles? Betty hurried over, her sharp eyes darting between David and Winter. "That baby yours?" she asked, her voice softer now. David hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, she's mine." There was no point in explaining. No one in this town would believe the full story anyway. Betty didn't question him further. Instead, she sighed and grabbed a box of newborn diapers. "You're gonna need these. And trust me, get the sensitive wipes. You don't want a rash on that little one." She started piling supplies into his basket, muttering about baby essentials. David let her. By the time they reached the register, he had an armful of necessities, and Betty had given him a full lecture on how to properly mix formula. As she rang up his purchases, she gave him a long look. "You sure about this, David?" she asked, her tone gentle but firm. He glanced down at Winter, her tiny fingers gripping his jacket. "Yeah," he said. "I'm sure." Betty nodded, handing him the receipt. Then welcome to fatherhood. A father's struggles. David quickly learned that taking care of a baby was a full-time job. The nights were the hardest. Winter would wake up crying at odd hours, her small voice piercing the silence of the house. David, who had been accustomed to sleeping in uninterrupted blocks, now found himself jolted awake multiple times a night. He tried everything, rocking her, patting her back, pacing the floor, but sometimes nothing worked. There were moments when frustration crept in, moments when he felt completely out of his depth. He wasn't built for this. What did he know about raising a child? And yet, every time he looked at Winter, he knew he couldn't give up. One night, after a particularly exhausting day, he sat on the couch with her, staring at the ceiling. "You're gonna drive me crazy, you know that," he muttered. Winter let out a small, content sigh, her tiny fingers curling around his pinky. David exhaled. Despite everything, the sleepless nights, the uncertainty, the fear, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. A sense of purpose. He had spent most of his life keeping people at arm's length, afraid of getting too close. But now, that choice was gone. He was no longer just David Calloway, the mechanic. He was Winter's father. The road ahead. Days turned into weeks. David's house slowly transformed. The tools and newspapers were replaced with baby blankets and bottles. The once lonely silence was now filled with the soft hum of lullabies and the occasional burst of Winter's laughter. But the outside world was not so easily changed. Whispers had already started spreading through town. People talked, speculated, judged. A white man raising a black baby. Where did she come from? Did he steal her? David didn't care about the rumors. He had faced judgment before, and he could handle it. But deep down, a part of him worried. Winter wasn't just his child. She was a mystery. Someone had abandoned her that night. And though she was safe now, her past wasn't finished with her yet. One day, the truth would come knocking. And when it did, David feared it would change everything. Shadows of the past. Years of love and sacrifice. The years that followed were a lesson in love, patience, and perseverance. David Calloway, the solitary mechanic who once lived in a house filled with silence, was now the father of a vibrant, curious, and strong-willed girl. Winter grew quickly, faster than David was prepared for. The sleepless nights of infancy transitioned into the energetic chaos of toddlerhood. She was a force of nature, always exploring, always questioning, and always defying expectations. She learned to walk earlier than most, her tiny legs carrying her with surprising speed across the living room floor. She had a fierce will, a determination that made David both proud and exhausted. As she grew older, she became his shadow, following him into the garage as he worked, watching him with wide, fascinated eyes. "Can I help, Daddy?" she would ask, her little voice full of eagerness. David would hand her a small, harmless tool, and she would sit beside him, mimicking his movements, pretending to fix things just like he did. She was his world. And despite the challenges, the whispers from townsfolk, the stares from strangers, the awkward questions, he wouldn't change a thing. A town that never forgets. Montgomery was a town with long memories and sharp tongues. People still talked. Some were kind, like Betty Walker, who had taken it upon herself to be Winter's honorary grandmother, bringing over fresh-baked cookies and knit blankets. But others weren't so kind. David heard the murmurs when he walked through town with Winter. "That ain't right. He should have let the state handle it. She don't belong with him." And though Winter was still too young to fully understand, David saw the way she sometimes clung to him tighter when strangers looked at her funny. One day, when she was around 6 years old, she asked him a question that shattered his heart. "Daddy, why do people stare at us?" David froze, setting down the wrench he had been working with. He had known this day would come. But he still wasn't ready for it. He crouched beside her, brushing a strand of curly hair from her face. "Because people don't always understand things that are different," he said carefully. Winter frowned, her little hands balling into fists. "But we're not different. You're my daddy." David swallowed the lump in his throat. He nodded. "That's right, sweetheart. And that's all that matters." Winter's big brown eyes stared at him, searching for something in his expression. Finally, she seemed satisfied, throwing her arms around his neck. "I love you, Daddy." David held her tightly. And in that moment, he silently promised her one thing. He would protect her, no matter what. The unanswered questions. As Winter grew, so did David's unspoken fears. She was smart, too smart for her own good sometimes, and as she reached her teenage years, she started asking harder questions. Where did I come from? Do I have a real family somewhere? Why did they leave me? David had always dreaded these questions, because the truth was, he didn't have answers. He had searched, of course. When he first found Winter, he had gone to the police, hoping they would find her biological family. But there had been no missing child reports matching her description. No desperate parents coming forward. The police had done a half-hearted investigation, but in the end, no one had claimed her. She had been discarded like trash. And so, David had raised her as his own. But now, as she neared her 18th birthday, he could see the longing in her eyes. She loved him. He knew that. But a part of her still wondered about where she truly came from. And as much as it hurt, he couldn't blame her. The call that changed everything. It happened on a quiet Sunday evening. Winter had just finished packing her bags for college, an accomplishment that filled David with both pride and sadness. She had worked so damn hard to earn a scholarship to a top university, and in just a few days, she would be leaving for a new chapter of her life. David had been preparing himself for the goodbye. But he wasn't prepared for what came next. The phone rang. He almost ignored it. But something, a gut feeling, a whisper of fate, urged him to pick up. Calloway. The voice on the other end was calm, precise, and unfamiliar. "Mr. Calloway, my name is Detective Harris. I'm calling regarding a cold case from 18 years ago." David's stomach clenched. "Cold case. I believe you're the legal guardian of Winter Calloway," the detective continued. David's grip on the phone tightened. "Yes. Why?" There was a brief pause. "Mr. Calloway, we've identified Winter's biological family. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. For 18 years, there had been nothing. No leads, no clues. And now, suddenly, after all this time, someone had found them. David's breath came out slow and controlled, but inside, his mind was racing. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice low. There was another pause. Then Detective Harris said something that made David's entire body go cold. "They're looking for her, Mr. Calloway, and they want to meet her." David's heart stopped. His grip on the phone tightened so hard his knuckles went white. Winter. His Winter. The little girl he had raised, loved, protected. She wasn't just his anymore. The past was no longer buried. And for the first time in years, David was truly afraid. The secrets beneath the surface. A world turned upside down. David sat at the kitchen table, gripping his coffee mug as if it were the only thing grounding him. The weight of the phone call still lingered in the air like a ghost. Winter's biological family had been found, and they wanted to meet her. It should have been a moment of relief, maybe even joy, but David felt nothing but unease. Why now? After all these years, he had searched for them once. There had been no records, no missing child reports, no desperate family searching for a lost daughter. So where had they been? And why were they looking now? The detective hadn't given him much information, only that a wealthy, influential family had recently come forward, claiming to be Winter's relatives. David had spent all night debating whether to tell Winter. She had the right to know. But a part of him, the part that had raised her, protected her, and loved her as his own, didn't trust it. Something felt off. And deep down, he feared that once she learned the truth, he might lose her forever. Winter's reaction. The next morning, David found Winter sitting on the porch swing, a half-packed suitcase beside her. She had always loved the mornings, the quiet calm before the world woke up. He hesitated for a moment before sitting beside her. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice steady, but careful. Winter turned to him, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" David exhaled. "I got a call last night, from a detective." Winter's eyebrows furrowed. "A detective?" David nodded. "They found your biological family." The world seemed to still for a moment. Winter's face was unreadable. She blinked slowly, as if trying to process what she had just heard. "They found them." Her voice was quiet, almost fragile. David nodded again. Winter turned away, staring into the distance. "How? I mean, after all this time?" David ran a hand through his graying hair. "I don't know, sweetheart. That's what worries me." Winter remained silent, her hands clasped together tightly. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "Who are they?" David hesitated. "A wealthy family. That's all the detective told me." Winter scoffed, shaking her head. "Of course, it couldn't just be normal people. It has to be some rich family." She let out a breathless laugh, but David could hear the edge of something painful behind it. She turned to face him, her deep brown eyes filled with conflict. "And they want to meet me." David nodded. "Yes, but listen, Winter." She cut him off. "I have to do this." David's stomach twisted. He had known this was coming, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Winter gave a small, sad smile. "I love you, Dad, but I've spent my whole life wondering where I came from. If I don't do this, I'll regret it forever." David swallowed hard. He had always known she would need this moment, and even though it scared him, he nodded. "Then I'll be right there with you." Winter's eyes softened. "Really?" David reached over, squeezing her hand. "Always." The meeting. A week later, David and Winter stood in front of the grandest house they had ever seen. It wasn't just a house. It was an estate with towering iron gates, perfectly manicured hedges, and a mansion that looked like something out of an old Southern aristocracy. David had never felt more out of place in his life. Winter however, stood tall beside him. She was nervous. David could see the way her fingers twitched at her side, but she was also determined. The gates opened. A sharply dressed butler led them through the sprawling property and into the main house, where a man and woman stood waiting. The man was tall, with graying hair and piercing blue eyes. His expensive suit was tailored to perfection. The woman, equally well-dressed, had a cold, calculating beauty. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then, the man stepped forward. "Winter." His voice was deep, commanding. "You look just like her." Winter hesitated. "Like who?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Your mother." Winter's breath caught. David narrowed his eyes. "And who exactly are you?" The man turned his gaze to David, as if he were only just noticing him. "I am Vincent Sinclair," he said smoothly. "And this is my wife, Eleanor." Winter frowned. "Sinclair." Vincent nodded. "Yes, we are your true family." David's jaw clenched at the word true. Winter crossed her arms. "Where have you been all my life?" Vincent sighed. "That is complicated." David scoffed. "Try me." Eleanor finally spoke, her voice like ice on glass. "You were taken from us," she said. Winter stiffened. "Taken?" Vincent nodded. "Kidnapped as an infant. We searched for you for years, but the case went cold. We never stopped looking." David's heart pounded. This didn't make sense. Winter had been found in the trash. Discarded. If they had been searching, how had no one found her? David looked Vincent dead in the eye. If that's true, why didn't the police have any record of a missing child? Vincent didn't flinch, because it was covered up. David's stomach dropped. Covered up. Vincent nodded. The people who took her, they didn't just abandon her. They tried to erase her existence. Winter's hands were shaking now. David could see it. The doubt, the fear, the flicker of hope. Eleanor finally stepped forward. "We have proof," she said, pulling out a folder. Inside were documents, old case files, DNA reports. Winter took it with trembling fingers. David felt something dark settle in his chest. Something wasn't right. But before he could say another word, Winter looked up. And her next words changed everything. "I want to know more." The unraveling truth. A decision that changed everything. Winter sat in the back seat of the limousine, staring down at the folder resting in her lap. Inside was the supposed truth, the key to the past she never knew. The weight of it pressed down on her like an invisible force. David sat beside her, tense and quiet. He didn't trust the Sinclairs. Something felt wrong. But Winter, his Winter, was looking for something she had been missing all her life. And he wouldn't stand in the way of that. Vincent Sinclair sat across from them, his expression calm, confident. Eleanor sat beside him, her eyes watching Winter closely, as if studying her reactions. "I know this is a lot to take in," Vincent said, breaking the silence. "You've lived your whole life without knowing where you truly belong. But that's why we're here, to fix what was stolen from you." Winter's fingers curled over the edge of the folder. "Stolen?" Vincent nodded. "You were taken as an infant, Winter. The people who did this to you, they were powerful, dangerous. They wanted to erase your existence." David's jaw clenched. "Why?" Eleanor finally spoke, her voice smooth and deliberate. "Because of who she is." Winter's head snapped up. "And who am I?" Vincent leaned forward slightly, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "You are Winter Sinclair. You are our daughter. And you are the rightful heir to the Sinclair fortune." A heavy silence filled the car. Winter's breath caught in her throat. David stiffened. "Heir?" Winter shook her head, overwhelmed. I don't understand." Vincent exhaled, then continued. "Our family has built an empire. Generations of wealth, influence, and power. You were meant to inherit it, to carry on the Sinclair legacy. But when you were born, there were those who didn't want that to happen. Eleanor's expression darkened. There were enemies, people within our own family. They wanted you gone. David clenched his fists. None of this made sense. Winter's voice was barely above a whisper. So they'd what? Kidnapped me. And then just left me in the trash. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. It was supposed to be worse. Winter's stomach twisted. David had heard enough. This sounds like a fairy tale, he snapped. You expect us to believe that a powerful family just lost track of a baby and never found her for almost 2 decades. Vincent's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice measured. It wasn't that simple. We were told you were dead. The investigation was shut down. Every trace of you erased. Winter bit her lip, her mind spinning. David shook his head. And yet, here you are, finding her just as she's about to go to college, just as she's about to start her life. Vincent smiled slightly. Fate works in mysterious ways. David didn't believe in fate. He believed in motives. And he was starting to think the Sinclairs had one. Buried memories. The limousine pulled up to the Sinclair estate. It was even more imposing up close. Massive columns, sprawling gardens, and a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. A butler opened the door, and Vincent gestured for Winter to follow. David stepped out behind her, his protective instincts screaming at him. This is your home, Winter, Eleanor said, walking toward the grand entrance. Or at least, it was meant to be. Winter swallowed hard. Could it really be true? Had she been meant for this life all along? David stayed close to her side as they entered the house. Inside, the air smelled like polished wood and expensive perfume. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting shimmering light across the marble floors. Winter looked around, taking everything in. The paintings, the staircases, the grand piano in the corner. It felt familiar. She hesitated. Why did it feel familiar? A headache started to press behind her eyes, a memory trying to surface. She reached for David's hand, gripping it tightly. He squeezed back, reassuring her. Vincent watched closely. You're remembering something, aren't you? Winter nodded slowly. I think so. I don't know how, but this place, it's not completely unfamiliar. Vincent smiled. Your mind buried the memories to protect you, but they'll come back. In time. David was done playing along. All right, he said, crossing his arms. Let's say I believe some of this. What do you want from her? Vincent and Eleanor exchanged a glance. Eleanor was the one who answered. To take her place in this family. David frowned. And what exactly does that mean? Vincent stepped closer to Winter. It means coming home, learning about your legacy, understanding the responsibility you were born into. Winter swallowed. And if I don't want that? For the first time, Eleanor's mask cracked. Her fingers tensed slightly against the pearl necklace she wore. Vincent's voice remained smooth. That's up to you. But we hope you'll stay. David could tell they weren't used to being told no. The shadows of the past. That night, Winter was given a room in the mansion. It was beautiful, like something out of a movie, but it didn't feel like home. David refused to leave. If Winter was staying, so was he. As the house settled into silence, Winter lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind wouldn't stop racing. Who had taken her? Who had left her to die? And why was she remembering things she had never known? A faint noise made her sit up. A whisper. She looked toward the door. Her heart pounded as she slipped out of bed and padded down the dark hallway. Something was pulling her, guiding her. She turned a corner and found herself standing in front of a heavy wooden door. She didn't know why, but she reached for the handle. It turned easily. The room beyond was dark, dusty, and inside, Winter's breath hitched. It was a nursery. Her nursery. A crib sat in the middle of the room, draped in white lace. Old stuffed animals lined the shelves. And on the far wall, a single portrait hung. A woman. Winter's eyes widened. She looked just like her. Her hands trembled as she stepped forward. And that's when she saw it. A small engraving at the bottom of the portrait. Her mother's name. And the date. Winter's breath caught in her throat. Her mother had died exactly 1 month after she was born. She turned, her pulse roaring in her ears. David stood in the doorway, his face pale. "Winter, we need to leave. Now." Winter frowned. "What? Why?" David's voice was low, urgent. "Because your mother didn't just die." He held up an old newspaper clipping. Winter's stomach dropped as she read the headline. "Heiress to Sinclair Empire found dead. Police suspect foul play." Her mother had been murdered, and someone had tried to make sure Winter was next. The final revelation. Trapped in the House of Secrets. Winter's hands trembled as she clutched the old newspaper clipping. The ink was faded, but the words burned into her mind. "Heiress to Sinclair Empire found dead. Police suspect foul play." Murder. Her mother hadn't died in an accident. She hadn't passed from illness. She was killed. David's voice was urgent. "Winter, we have to get out of here. Now." She couldn't move. Her legs felt like lead. "No," she whispered. "I need answers." David's eyes darted toward the hallway behind them. Something wasn't right. Winter took a shaky breath. Someone in this house knows the truth. David stepped closer, lowering his voice. "And you think they're just going to hand it to you? These people." He gestured around the dark hallway. "Have had almost 2 decades to cover this up. You're standing in the middle of their lies." She swallowed hard. He was right. But still, she had to know. Footsteps echoed down the hall. David pulled her back into the shadows. A figure passed by, a man in a dark suit. Not a servant. Someone else. Winter's pulse raced. David's hand closed around hers. "This isn't safe. We have to go." Winter clenched her jaw. "Not yet." She turned and walked back toward the grand staircase. David cursed under his breath but followed. If they were going to get out of here, they needed more than suspicions. They needed proof. The secret chamber. Winter followed her instincts. She wasn't sure how, but her feet carried her through the halls with a strange certainty. It was as if something inside her already knew where to go. David whispered behind her, "Where are we?" She stopped in front of a tall bookcase in the east wing. Winter ran her fingers along the wood. Something was off. Then she felt it, a small indentation along the side. A keyhole. Her breath hitched. Vincent had given her a key earlier that day. He'd called it a piece of your past. She pulled it from her pocket and slid it in. A soft click. The bookcase swung open. David let out a low whistle. "You've got to be kidding me." Behind the bookcase, a narrow staircase spiraled downward into darkness. Winter's heart pounded. David shook his head. "No way. We're not doing this." Winter took a step inside. "We have to." David muttered a curse but followed. The air grew colder as they descended. At the bottom, a dimly lit corridor stretched before them. Winter took a slow step forward. The floor was stone, old and uneven. At the end of the hallway, a metal door stood ajar. Winter pushed it open. Inside was a hidden archive. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old records, photos, and documents. David picked up a dusty file. "Winter." She turned. He held up a birth certificate. Her birth certificate. Winter snatched it from his hands. But something was wrong. Her last name wasn't Sinclair. It was Monroe. Her breath caught. "What?" she whispered. David pulled out another file. "Winter, I don't think Vincent and Eleanor are your parents." Her hands shook. A photo was paper-clipped to the file. A woman held a baby in her arms, smiling down at her. Winter recognized that face. It was the same woman from the portrait upstairs. Her mother. A chill ran down her spine. She turned to David. "They lied." He nodded grimly. "And I think we just found out why." The Sinclairs' ultimate betrayal. Before Winter could speak, the lights flickered. Then, The door slammed shut. Winter gasped and spun around. Vincent Sinclair stood in the doorway. Eleanor was behind him, her face unreadable. David moved protectively in front of Winter. "So, you knew she'd find this, didn't you?" Vincent sighed. It was only a matter of time. Winter clenched the file. "You lied to me." Vincent nodded slowly. "Yes." Winter's voice shook. "Why?" Eleanor finally spoke. "Because we had no choice." David scoffed. "There's always a choice." Vincent took a step forward. "Your real mother was my sister, Winter. Her name was Vivian Monroe. She wasn't supposed to inherit the Sinclair fortune, but when our father died, he changed everything. He left the estate to her." Winter's stomach twisted. Eleanor's voice was softer. There were those who disagreed with his decision. David's eyes darkened. "So they killed her." A long silence stretched between them. Then Vincent whispered, "Yes." Winter's knees nearly buckled. David caught her. "Who?" Vincent exhaled. "My brother." Winter's breath hitched. Eleanor continued, "Your uncle." Winter's fingers dug into the file. "Why?" "Because of money." Vincent's jaw clenched. "Because she wasn't supposed to exist. She was the daughter of our father and a black woman. A secret he tried to keep." Winter's heart pounded. David muttered, "Jesus Christ." Eleanor's expression softened. She was brilliant, strong, and she was meant to take over the Sinclair empire. But my brother, he wouldn't allow it. Winter's vision blurred with rage. "And me." Vincent's gaze darkened. "He wanted to erase your bloodline completely." Winter swallowed the lump in her throat. "So, he..." Eleanor nodded. "He ordered you to be killed. But someone couldn't do it." Winter's mind spun. "Who?" Vincent's face turned somber. "The man who left you in the trash." Winter's pulse roared in her ears. Eleanor's voice was soft. "He didn't save you because he was cruel. He saved you because he was afraid." David's grip tightened around Winter's hand. "And what now? Are you going to let her leave?" Vincent hesitated. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a gun. Winter's blood ran cold. David pushed her behind him. "You can't be serious." Vincent's voice was steady. "We can't let the truth come out." Winter's breath shuddered. "You were going to let me believe you were my parents." Eleanor's expression wavered. "We wanted to protect you." David spat. "By locking her in a golden cage." Winter's eyes stung. "I trusted you." Vincent's hand tightened around the gun. "I wish it didn't have to be this way." Then a voice rang out. "Neither do I." A gun cocked. Everyone froze. Standing in the doorway was Frank. Winter gasped. "Dad." Frank stepped inside, his face grim. He aimed a revolver straight at Vincent's head. "Let her go," he said coldly. Vincent hesitated. Frank didn't. He fired. A deafening bang echoed through the room. Vincent collapsed. Eleanor screamed. David grabbed Winter's hand. "Let's go." Winter's mind was a whirlwind as they ran, through the corridors, up the stairs, out the front doors. Frank was right behind them. They didn't stop running until they reached Frank's truck. Winter turned to her father, tears streaming down her face. "How did you know?" Frank exhaled heavily. "Because I've spent the last 18 years waiting for the past to come back." David helped Winter into the truck. "What now?" Frank's eyes hardened. "Now, we end this. And this time, no one would take Winter away again."